the USDA is not your friend, and they're not your ally, at least not if you're a consumer. The USDA is a bit like your schizophrenic uncle. They have two jobs. They have job number one, which is to help agriculture do well. Now that's why they're called the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The second job that they have, when I say our agriculture, that includes both farming and ranching. And their job is to make sure that farmers and ranchers are taken care of and protected, I guess you could say, because, of course, obviously, food production is a critical part of life. Now, the second part of what the USDA does is they define the food pyramid, the food guidelines for eating for all Americans. And a large part of the world looks to the USDA's food pyramid to make their decisions about food guidance as well for their citizens. So on the one hand, we have business, which theoretically should just be agriculture. And on the other hand, we have our health being handled by the same governmental agency. This is a disaster because historically the government would make the food pyramid and make the food guidelines based on what was best for Americans. But eventually the USDA was like, well, gosh, we have a bit of a conflict here because we're trying to support agriculture, and if we aren't devising the food guidelines based on what is going to best support agriculture, well, it may not work out for some of the farmers, some of the agricultural businesses. And it just so happens that the agricultural businesses that stand to lose the most if the USDA were to actually produce a food pyramid and food guidelines that were what was best for Americans are the giant ones that have the most money, that have pushed out a lot of small farms and ranches, and care the least about us. And on top of that, these are the ones that snap up the vast majority of the subsidies for things like corn and wheat and soy and dairy and so on and so forth. So what the USDA is actually primarily supporting isn't even necessarily the small farmers and ranchers, but it is supporting institutionalized giant corporations, in some cases multinational corporations, to be able to produce junk food through the subsidization of crops like wheat and corn and soy. And if you think about it, if you look in your ingredients list of a product, on a lot of products, you're going to either see milk products, which don't even need to be there. They just add it because it's so cheap that they can afford to. You'll see corn products, and you'll see soy products. These three things are by far the most common things that you will see in just about, well, the majority of products that are sold in America, that are made in America, because it's so cheap. So you go to the store and you can see such cheap prices for chips, for example. And so it's really insane because the food guidelines are what keep us alive or what kill us. And if the USDA is feeding us crap in those guidelines, then the USDA is killing us in order to make sure that these giant corporations that lobby huge amounts of money every year with the government to influence laws to benefit them, that influence laws that protect companies like Monsanto from lawsuits, that do all kinds of things that are not in the best interests of the American public, and lead to, number one, doctors do not get an education in nutrition unless they choose to pursue that themselves. The lobbies and industries have a huge influence in revolving door because of revolving door positions within the USDA, the FDA, and other government organizations that are connected to food and commerce. So you could think of the USDA as an extension of a chamber of commerce rather than as a government agency, because their top priority is making these giant companies who are sucking at the teat of our tax money richer and richer. So they get huge discounts because the government subsidizes these products, and they make huge profits for themselves and their investors, and they kill us at the same time. Now, in my mind, any company that is going to have to, not company, but an agency that has to choose between our health and the health of businesses, if that doesn't have a clear mandate that is uncorruptible by this president or that president or this Congress or that Congress or the head of the organization, in fact, it ultimately what will happen is the needs of the businesses, and in this case it's not even a need, it's an abuse, it's an addiction, will be put before the needs of consumers, and we will pay the price. Because, okay, so if you look at the idea that there's an unhealthy amount of dairy and corn and soy and maybe some other things in our food, that means that we are getting an excess amount of nutrition from those types of food. And it's true, actually. So if you look at omega-3 and omega-6, we're getting way more than we need because of the prevalence of soy and corn in so many different kinds of food. And it's putting the ratio out of whack. Now, I've seen sources that say we should get more omega-3. I've seen sources that say we should get more omega-6. But currently, we're getting like somewhere between 25 to 50 omega-6s per omega-3, which is way higher than what is recommended, even for the ones that put omega-6 as being we need more of than omega-3, which means we don't even need to consume omega-6 because we're getting way too much of it and it's hurting our health. It's out of balance with what our bodies need. So I believe it would be a better idea, maybe not an ideal choice, but it would be a better idea if the USDA was stripped of its power to determine the food or the nutrition guidelines for us, number one. Number two, the nutrition facts need to be revised to make it easier for us to understand. Because as you notice on most packaging, you won't see mono and polyunsaturated fats listed here. And it needs to be made in a way that consumers can easily understand what's good and what's bad. Now, I've talked to doctors. I've done a lot of research on this. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor, but I've done a lot of research. And I did talk to a doctor yesterday and told the doctor what I think is correct. And this doctor, she has over 30 years of medical practice. She's very, very knowledgeable. And she said, yeah, you're right on the money on it. So we should have nutrition facts that the average American can easily understand. This is good and this is bad. So for example, things like saturated fat. should have a clear indicator that that's bad. And things like mono and polyunsaturated fats should be clearly indicated as something that's good. And we should have a score for every product based on the ratio of fat and cholesterol, sodium, and carbohydrates. So if we have a product that's high in saturated fats and it's also high in sugar, that would be a product that's very bad for us because because simple sugars are bad for us. You know, things like table sugar, as it might be called, or honey or anything like that. That has a lot of sugar in it, and when you intake a lot of fat along with a lot of sugar, you're going to end up potentially with insulin resistance, which leads to prediabetes, which leads to diabetes, type 2. And that's the very simplified version of how it works. I'm not going to explain in more detail than that. So yeah, the FDA should take over the food guidelines, the nutrition information, and there are other countries where they've actually done this, where they've actually revised package information so that consumers of most intelligence levels can understand, oh, this is not actually good for me. I should not be eating this. And I think that's what we need. The problem is that politicians and policy makers are more interested in accepting campaign money and accepting future jobs within the industry that is approaching them than they are in our best interests. And some of them even eat the crap that we eat, knowing full well that it's bad for them. But, you know, they're very selfish people. They're very hedonistic, and they don't really care if they're going to die of a heart attack, I guess. I don't know what the problem is, but a lot of people are confused. There's a lot of misinformation being spread directly and indirectly by the food and beverage industries, including the sugar industry, the dairy industry, the meat industry, the egg industry, junk food industry, fast food industry, and processed foods industries, that it's mind-bogglingly complex to determine who's telling the truth and who's lying and who's mixing the truth and fiction together to make it even harder to tell. Now, I can't 100% of the time tell when somebody's fibbing about what's good for us and what is bad for us, but I'm getting pretty good at it, and it is disturbing the number of documentaries that I have found that cleverly mix fact and fiction together to make you believe that what they're telling you is all truth. It's not. If they tell you, oh, you should be eating meat, it's great for you. Well, no. Red meat is a type 2A carcinogen, which means it has been linked to cancer but not definitively proven. Processed meats, which include lunch meats and sausages and hot dogs and stuff, have been proven to be a type 1 carcinogen, which puts them on the same level with things like asbestos and plutonium and stuff like that. They have definitively been proven to cause cancer. And then we've got dairy, which is got so high in fat. And actually, back in the 60s, I think it was, or the 50s, Finland was the country with the largest number of men dying of heart attacks. And it was because these were physically fit men. They were lumberjacks and farmers and other kinds of laborers. And these men were dying at young ages of heart attacks because they had a diet that was very high in dairy. And the Finnish government responded to the people's cries for help. Please, we're losing our husbands, we're losing our fathers, please help us. And Pekka Puska or something like that, and a team of other young scientists were hired to fix the problem. And they worked initially in a place called North Karelia, which is on the border with Russia. and they worked with the wives because the men were very stubborn. They didn't want to stop smoking, they didn't want to stop drinking, and they didn't want to stop eating their dairy food. But the wives wanted to save their husbands despite the husband's stupidness. So the scientists advised the wives, here's what you need to do. Weed out all the milk as much as you can, and cheese, and replace butter with margarine and cooking oil, like canola oil is what they focused on, and do a few other things. And so they changed all these things. They changed the recipes that they were using, and lo and behold, unsurprisingly, the rate of heart diseases and attacks and stuff dropped to the point where this became a national program for all of Finland. And Finland went from being the country with the highest rate of heart attacks, and they have been climbing up and up the ladder away from that dubious distinction ever since then. And it's also because they cut down on fatty meats, sticking more to the lean meats, and eating a lot more fruits and vegetables that are good for you. Now, I know I'm getting a little bit off the subject here of the USDA, but the point here is that if the USDA was being honest with us, if the USDA actually cared for us, they would have a nutrition facts label that was easy to understand what's good, what's bad, what combinations are bad, an overall score for the food to let us know this is super healthful for us. It's healthful, but don't eat too much. This is a processed food that may endanger your health. This is something that's not good for your health. This is something that is really bad for your health. Whatever. And they would have everything very clear, and they would not be bowing down to the demands of the lobbies. I mean, there was one point, the WHO, the World Health Organization, which is a part of the United Nations, put out a statement regarding certain types of food that are bad for health. And off the top of my head, I can't remember whether it was dairy or dairy, meat, and eggs, or what it was, but or maybe it was sugar, because the simple sugar industry is also extremely powerful and very abusive of their laborers. The industries that the World Health Organization was declaring their food was very bad for your health went to the politicians and said, this is not good. We can't have this. You need to stop this. You need to do something about this, because there's also a congressional committee that was looking into this. So what they did was they had Senator McCarthy, I believe it was the head of the committee, and he and other politicians were looking at the results of a study by a guy named Ansel Keys that looked at different nations and found a strong correlation between the consumption of meat, dairy, and eggs, and heart disease, and death. So there was that, and then there was the declaration by the WHO, and these were not at the exact same time, but when this commission in the 1970s was preparing a report warning Americans to reduce their consumption of meat, dairy, and eggs, the food lobby came in and pressured them so hard that they removed those things from the report and changed the report to say, get this, fat. And as a consequence, Americans not most Americans did not understand that what the fat that was being referenced was primarily from meat, dairy, and eggs, and that it was saturated fat. Now, I grew up in this time, and I don't really remember being aware that they were talking about saturated fat. It was all about fat. And certainly on packaging, it didn't say this is a low saturated fat product, this is a no saturated fat product. And the labeling guidelines from the FDA were slippery enough that even though there was fat in the product, saturated fat, they could declare that it was a no-fat product. And that kind of shenanigans continues to this day. Low lactose products can be labeled no lactose if they're low enough. And that's bad for people who have milk allergies and or who are very lactose intolerant like me. So they whitewashed the report to make it so that people didn't stop eating these things that were bad for us. And then the whole industry went crazy producing things that were low in fat, but not specifying saturated fat. And also, in order to make the food that was low in fat taste good again, they had to put a lot of salt and a lot of sugar in, which was bad for us. So, of course, we've traded one source of problems for another. And the WHO's report, when it came out, this was when Tommy Thompson was in Congress and a couple of other congressional leaders, and Bush, I think it was Bush the second was in Congress, so this would have been in the not in Congress, in the presidential position. So Bush the second, the dickwad that he was, sent Tommy Thompson to the WHO and said, look, our food industry is in an uproar about your declaration against their products, and if you don't pull that declaration against those products, we're going to not give you any funding this year. The U.S. government will withhold the funding it is expected to give this year, which was hundreds of millions of dollars. And of course, the WHO, needing the money, backed off. So, dirty politics. And it goes so deep and so wide. The environment is being destroyed by the dairy, meat, and egg industries. I mean, we're talking about they produce more methane, which is worse than carbon dioxide, than the transportation sector. And they produce so much manure that when it comes to pigs, it just goes into these, I guess you could say, waste ponds, which leak into the water table and contaminate it with E. coli and other kinds of bacteria. Sometimes if there's like a big storm, the retaining wall, which is made of dirt, gets damaged, and the water goes right into the streams and lakes and kills huge amounts of marine life. It also results in the biggest state, I believe, for pork production is in North Carolina. And in North Carolina, anybody living near those pig farms is at a much higher risk of a wide variety of diseases than people who don't live near ranches like that. And in addition, the manure from other types of animal farms is also not processed properly and is sometimes sprayed raw onto fields, which leads to outbreaks of bacteria in crops. It also leads to contamination of the water table, and then by extension, we get these dead zones along the coasts. In America, if you go to New Zealand, it's even worse because New Zealand's really small. So all this manure and stuff is going off of New Zealand. And if you've watched movies like The Lord of the Rings and a lot of others, you'll see that New Zealand has some very beautiful scenery. But in the areas where there are these animal farms, these ranching operations that are industrial in nature, first of all, there's so much waste they can't process it all, and it's creating these huge dead zones around New Zealand. And second of all, the the way that a lot of these big ranchers treat their animals is extremely inhumane. I mean, I saw a video. I've seen videos that made me cry. And I showed one to my son about what they do to male piglets, and it made him cry as well, because imagine this: you're a baby piglet, you're maybe about this big, and somebody picks you up, butt up, and takes a knife and cuts. No anesthetics, okay? Because anesthetics are too time consuming and they're too expensive. So to save time and money, they cut open the scrotum of these baby male piglets. And then the guy squeezes the scrotum and the testicles pop out, and he literally rips the testicles off this piglet. And they do something similar with male cows and stuff too. And the animal screams and screams and screams. They don't provide any antibiotics for this open wound. So some of these animals get these horrible infections and end up dying. And it's mortifying. It's just so monstrously inhumane what these ranchers do to their animals. And pigs are some of the smartest animals based on scientific studies. Cows are also actually pretty intelligent. They're also extremely social, which makes them so easy to use because of their social structure. If you look, the majority of the animals that we work with are they have a social hierarchy. And that's one of the reasons that it's easy for us to abuse them for food, is because we can take advantage of that social hierarchy. And mother cows, when they've had a baby, the baby, after a certain period of time, depending on which farm, it could be days, it could be weeks, the baby is taken away. And sometimes I've seen videos where the men pick up these calves and they literally throw them with complete disregard for the cow's health and safety into trucks. And calves that are trying to get back to their mothers are pushed or hit, or whatever, and have other calves thrown against them, and it's just so abusive. And you can actually see these mother cows following along behind, trying to stay with their baby, and it's heartbreaking. And the list of abuses against animals that we eat goes on and on and on. And the environmental damage is massive. And now, in America, in New Zealand, and other places, if you try to film these ranching operations abusing animals, they can bring you up on criminal charges, which is just insane. But they don't want the public to know, because they don't want the public to care about what's going into your mouth. And the USDA is hand in hand with these corporations. And if you think that the subsidies are helping the small farmers, no, the corporations generally gobble up the vast majority of all those subsidies out there. And then there are the lies like organic. Organic makes people think, oh wow, they must have been very nice to the animals. No, organic has nothing to do with being nice to the animals. Organic just means that the food that the animals were fed didn't contain any man-made chemicals. Now, natural chemicals, natural fertilizers, natural pesticides and herbicides and fungicides are okay. Those are also toxic to us, but they're okay. It only means that man-made chemicals were not applied to these crops and to these animals. And that's just one example. And then there's the whole lies around cage-free, free range, and the only one that's real, the only one that you can actually trust is pasture raised. So if you see an animal product and it's labeled cage-free or free range. Those are supposed to be two different things. Free range is supposed to mean, or should mean, that the animal is able to range freely within the farm. But the truth of the matter is that cage-free and free range generally mean exactly the same thing, which is that the animal, especially chickens now, but other animals as well, is trapped within a large farm, and they are either fed food that predisposes them to producing lots of mass very quickly, or they have been genetically modified to produce lots of mass quickly, or both. And they grow so fast that their bones can't properly support them, so a lot of them will die because they can't breathe. They'll die because they get infections, and the risk to the ranchers that are doing these farms, these giant buildings full of chickens, and when I say full of chickens, I mean there's not a lot of space per chicken, really, and in some it's bad for the ranchers because it causes all kinds of health problems for the ranchers, and it's bad for the chickens because the chickens are raised in such a way that they are handicapped. They are often collected at night and treated inhumanely by the men who are coming and taking the chickens away, including having the chickens being thrown and kicked and otherwise abused. And you may think, it's just a chicken, but you may think, oh, it's just a pig or a cow. They're made to be eaten. No, they're not made to be eaten. They're made to live. But we have perverted that whole system from what used to be a fairly ethical and considerate farming system of the old days to a system where animals are treated as nothing more than dollar signs. And so they're treated as bad as, if not worse than, the way we used to treat African slaves. And so basically they're treated as objects, not as creatures with feelings, not as creatures with some intelligence. And the USDA allows it. But it's horrifying. If you just take the time to watch videos about this stuff, it's just absolutely horrifying, especially when you understand, when you put an animal in that kind of situation, that animal will start producing stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, and then the animal is slaughtered. And sometimes the slaughtering process doesn't work right, so they don't gas these animals. They may cut their throats and let them bleed out, which takes a few minutes of death before the death sets in. They will sometimes, before the animal is even dead, they will catch the animal using a hook into the leg, and then hang them upside down, and then they'll slaughter them. So if you can imagine somebody taking a sharp hook and sticking it into your thigh, and hanging you upside down, and then cutting your throat. Now, in the case of cows, what they'll do is they'll take what's called a bolt gun, and they'll shoot. And the bolt gun has this bolt that pops out and then retracts back into the gun, and it goes in through the skull into the brain, and because of the very rapid penetration, it basically, the sudden change in pressure basically liquefies the brain, and the cow dies instantly, which is great, except for the fact that there's a large number of cows that move when the bolt is going in. So instead of killing the cow, it just damages the cow's brain. The cow's still functioning, the cow's still aware, and then the bolt gun doesn't work anymore because the pressure has already been taken off by the first failed attempt. And so further, it may take 2, 3, 4 times during which the cow is suffering to try and actually incapacitate the cow. And sometimes the cow actually ends up not being dead when it goes into the slaughtering process. And the same is also true of pigs. They use bolt guns on pigs as well, and sheep and stuff. And the list just goes on and on. And the USDA is complicit in this. And certain other, there are a lot of politicians who are in the pockets of the food and beverage industry. And it's ridiculous when we actually have, within Congress, we have committees that are set up in Congress and in various government agencies dealing with food and health. And their responsibility is to mandate what's best for public health. But instead, because these committees are people by people from the food and beverage industry, or people who have been offered very lucrative positions afterwards in the food and beverage industry, we don't get decisions made for our best interests. We get decisions made for the interests of businesses, and we become cash cows ourselves, because they are feeding us garbage. They're feeding us these processed foods that are so very, very bad for us, and they don't care. And doctors are not taught about nutrition, so they don't know how to advise us correctly. And so when we go in, because we've got heart disease, we've got high blood pressure, we've got diabetes, we've got urticaria, we've got all kinds of autoimmune diseases, and so on and so forth. Excuse me. Excuse me. The doctor doesn't say, you know what, it's because your diet, you're eating too much meat, dairy, eggs, processed foods. They say, you know what, here's some Lipitor for that cholesterol. Here's some metformin for diabetes. Here's this and that, and they just pop pills into you because that's all they know how to do anymore. Or if it's bad enough, then you get surgery too. So doctors are no longer, in these cases, treating the cause of the problem. And sometimes it's our fault, because if a doctor does tell you, you're like, you know what, I really love meat though. I can't stop. I just can't. Or you're like, I don't care. If I die, I die. I'm going to die someday anyway, so I'm going to enjoy my life. I'm going to eat what I want to eat. But doctors often don't tell us what we need to do. And if they do say anything, like when I went to my cardiologist, I was very disappointed. I mean, on the one hand, I was very grateful because he told me, because of my family history of heart disease and hypertension and stuff, that if I really wanted to know if I had plaque buildup around my heart, which is called atherosclerosis, if I really wanted to know whether that was there or not, in addition to a stress test, I should do a calcification test, which is they do an MRI of the area of your heart. And I said, well, okay. And he said, but insurance probably won't cover it. And I said, okay, well, how much is it? And he said, well, it's probably like $100 something like that. I don't know how much it cost. I never got the bill because I fought the insurance company and I convinced them that it was in their best interest to pay for the scan because it's preventive medicine is cheaper for them than paying again and again and again for drugs. But it did discover that I have atherosclerosis. So we have this revolving door that healthcare is now controlled by these giant corporations for the large part. I've talked to doctors and they're very dissatisfied with the situation. They are now basically in a position of they can't afford to leave these organizations because their debt from the universities is so crushing, and they can't go into family practice or private practice anymore because there's the competition from the healthcare industry, the giant corporations, is so powerful that they can't stay in business. They can't compete, and they can't give their customers, the patients, us people, the amount of time that they feel we deserve or need, because the healthcare corporations give them time quotas or give them the number of patients they have to see per day. So they may get 10, 15 minutes, and you can't often properly diagnose a patient in just 10 to 15 minutes. And labs are discouraged. Lab tests are discouraged. So, I went to see a dermatologist because I've had some skin problems lately, and they never did any kind, not my GP, not my dermatologist, and no other doctors ever did any kind of a lab test to find out what kind of bacteria or yeast or fungus was infesting my skin, so they could target it specifically with a drug made for that organism. So we have, think about it this way. The food industry and the beverage industry, they start things out. They make us sick. Then we go to the healthcare industry, which instead of treating the cause, treats the symptoms most of the time with medication. So the healthcare industry is getting money off of our misery, and then the pharmaceutical industry's getting money off of us, and then the surgeons are getting money because instead of treating the cause, they're treating the symptoms. And so all these industries are benefiting, and investors are benefiting from our misery, from our poor health, and from the fact that we are not being given the right information from the start from the USDA. The USDA's power to administer food guidelines should be stripped and maybe given to the FDA, I don't know. But certainly it should be run by a meritocratic organization of doctors and scientists who are not involved in a revolving door opportunity with the food and beverage industries, the pharmaceutical industries, the healthcare industries. Wow, I didn't think this was going to become this long of a video. So I'm going to stop right now. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.